Thank you very much for that introduction, Eamon. I'm pleased to be here as in the real three-dimensional individual rather than the two-dimensional virtualized Jacob Rees-Mogg. William, when he spoke a little bit about the position in the UK and the morning after the vote the night before, however many votes we've had. I was sent a quote which reflected the mood in the UK, and it said, "Many of us have a feeling that we have a country where fanatics, hooligans and eccentrics have got the upper hand." Now, I'm not actually sure whether that was a quote by Jacob or whether it was a quote about Jacob. But I think what can be certain is it's a quote that could be used by either end of the spectrum in this particular debate. I think it shows how polarised the UK has become. I was asked a few months ago to speak today to a title, "Where Has the Bailiwick Landed?" But at 11 a.m. on Friday, 12 hours before Brexit was supposed to happen, we agreed that it probably made more sense to actually change the title to "Where is the Bailiwick of Guernsey Heading?" But before I attempt to answer that question, I think I probably need to answer, excuse me, two different questions. Firstly, how did we get here, and where are we? Now, much of this, many of you in the audience may have heard in various different fora over recent months before. And I make no apology for that, because I think much of it does actually bear repetition. And actually, despite all the news, this 24-hour news cycle we have with all these dramatic events going on, actually, the bailiwick's position has changed remarkably little and remarkably slowly, and I'll come back to that. But let's first of all address that first question: how did we get here? As, of course, everybody in this audience will know, Guernsey did not participate in the 1975 referendum, and we did not participate in the 2016 referendum. Now, as an aside, there are very many ironies in this story, and I will touch on them as I go through this morning. But one of them is that in a process apparently designed for the purpose of taking back control, we've had no control. As a small jurisdiction surrounded by larger neighbours, this is not a particularly new experience, of course, for us. We've been used to being policy takers in a number of international initiatives. And if Jacob had been here, he probably wouldn't have wanted me to hear me saying this, but it's one that the UK is going to have to get used to if and when the UK does leave the EU, whether it's in the field of data protection, anti-money laundering or tax transparency. The UK is going to be a policy taker, working with the EU's rules in the form of GDPR, AMLD5, and the Code Group on Business Taxation, except it will be doing so as a third country without any input rather than as a member state. And it also never ceases to surprise me how, even in a representative democracy, so few people really determine policy direction for 65 million. Because don't kid yourselves, we are where we are today, not because 17.4 million people took back control in June 2016, but because of the decisions of a much smaller number of individuals and politicians. Not even all 650 MPs. James Goldsmith, remember him, Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg himself, of course, David Cameron and George Osborne for agreeing to pledge a referendum in their 2015 manifesto for an election that they had no real expectation of winning. Theresa May for calling an election in 2017 in which she had no real expectation of losing her majority. The key advisors around the Prime Minister who painted the red lines in the Lancaster House speech, the 10 DUP MPs, Cooper, Letwin, Bowles, and so on. And whether or not Parliament digs itself out of its current impasse, or whether in spite of last night's vote, the EU allows a no-deal exit a week tomorrow, will also be determined by just a handful of individuals, potentially just two in the UK, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. Who would have thought that? And 27 in the Council in the European Council. So welcome to taking back control. In 1975, the British public were told the European community was all about trade in the common market. Remember that term? The political objectives of the whole enterprise, driving to what is now termed in the Treaty of Lisbon, ever closer union. Very worthy objectives, I think, given their origins in the post-World War II objective of an admirable intent of avoiding yet another conflict in Europe. Those were downplayed. And of course, in 2016, the British public were promised an extra £350 million a week for their beloved NHS, whilst preserving trading links, with no mention of red lines being established around the need to leave the customs union and the single market. Of course, the single market having been created on the drive of a Conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. So by reducing the question to yes or no in 1975, as it was, or leave or remain in 2016, the arguments to support either response were shortened too. And in the 41 years between the two questions being put to the public, arguably, there were only two openly Europhile prime ministers, Ted Heath and Tony Blair, with all the others playing a variety of Eurosceptic tunes to a receptive news media. So it can hardly be a surprise that although 67% voted to stay in 1975, Britain never truly fell in love with the European project and therefore apparently warmed to the idea of taking back control. The European project was divisive in Britain long before it formally joined in 1973, and it has remained so ever since. And no doubt it will remain so whether or not it now leaves. Many have noted that it has shortened the careers of every Conservative Party leader since Margaret Thatcher. It's been a slow infection in the UK's political bloodstream, which, I think, continuing the analogy, seems in the last few months, weeks and months, to have turned to full-blown sepsis. The question now is whether it could lead to the loss of some limbs. A ludicrous suggestion only a short time ago, but one that cannot be entirely dismissed today. The impact on the Scottish independence question will not be truly known for some time. Renewed troubles in Northern Ireland cannot be ruled out, and arguably should be everyone's greatest concern. And the breakdown of party discipline even risks the House of Commons attempting to legislate for matters which lie firmly outside their remit and within our own domestic autonomy, breaching 9 centuries of constitutional precedent, which would undoubtedly cause us to question and re-evaluate our relationship with the UK. I'm referring, of course, to the Modge Amendment laid by Margaret Hodge and Andrew Mitchell, which obviously William kindly addressed in his questions to Jacob, of course purporting to legislate for the public registers of beneficial ownership here. And in another irony, they are seeking to do so by way of an amendment to a Brexit implementation bill, a bill about taking back sovereignty from Guernsey, a bill about taking back sovereignty from Brussels is being used to subrogate the sovereignty of a smaller jurisdiction. If it wasn't so serious, given their own mess, it would be laughable that any current MP would have the audacity to advance an argument that they can legislate for us on the basis of good government. As another aside, and I'm very glad for the video that we can clearly rely on the rock-solid support of Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I would hope his colleagues in the European Research Group to resist this amendment as and when it comes to be debated in the House of Commons, as it surely will, and I will return to that. So that is how we got here, but where exactly is here? Here is, we're presently in the customs union for the free movement of goods by virtue of Protocol 3, as William said when he spoke to Jacob. Here is where we're out We're in for the out for the free movement of goods, but in for the free movement of goods, but out for everything else. Here, of course, is where Daniel Hannan, MEP, wanted the UK to move to when he visited the island in 2015. Here is being given notice by our larger neighbour that as they are redrawing the boundaries with their own neighbours, they'll be knocking down the garden shed. Here is that they've promised to build us a new one, but they can't quite tell us where it will be, or its size, or its colour. But that will come in phase 2 of their negotiations with their neighbours about exactly where their new boundaries are going to be. Here is being landed with a lot of uninvited costs for our taxpayers and community. Those of you in the audience who knew the late Dave Jones, a member of UKIP, will know that he will be spinning in his grave particularly at the prospect that MOTs have been imposed on us not because of the EU, but because of the UK is leaving the EU. Another irony. Here is the diversion of people and resources in our own small administration away from our own policy priorities to deal with someone else's. Here is looking at the political chaos in the United Kingdom, speculating on whether the governing party may split and on whether the government will collapse and on whether there'll be a general election might be called. Although personally I struggle to see how that could possibly resolve anything. Here is a lot of uncertainty for our business leaders. In short, here is not a very comfortable place, and everyone needs to move on to somewhere more comfortable as rapidly as possible. Now, we have planned extensively, starting before the UK decided to leave to hold the referendum. We've responded to each twist and turn to protect our interests, and those landmarks have included the triggering of Article 50, the negotiation and publication of the withdrawal agreement and its territorial extent, and detailed contingency planning for the risk of a no-deal scenario. Whilst we cannot be sure that we know where we are headed, we have packed for the journey. One thing has been clear throughout this chaotic process. Here in Guernsey, we have provided an oasis of calm response, a haven of stability for our business community, and we have worked through the challenges that might be created by Brexit with clarity and, in a lesson for Westminster, with consensus among our politicians. On Friday last week, by simple regulation, we changed the law in Guernsey to acknowledge the 12th of April as the next date that the UK is likely to leave the EU. Our enabling legislation, unlike the UK's, had foreseen and allowed for flexibility to change the Brexit as defined in Guernsey law. The government of Guernsey has engaged with the UK government as it's developed its position over the course of the last two and a half years. We've tried to be one step ahead by planning for a range of outcomes and by being ready to react whatever the results from the UK government's own decisions and the UK Parliament's deliberations. And this has helped us plot our own path, one that works for Guernsey's interests in response to whatever the UK decision that they finally make. Guernsey's system of government by independence relies on consensus and compromise to make decisions. Each decision can be freely challenged at the time that it's made, taking into account the range of the views that make up our Parliament. Guernsey's politicians are used to compromise and finding common ground. We respect the will of the majority. The consensus and political stability that Guernsey has is something that the UK government and UK parliamentarians are only now seeking for themselves. Over the last 2 years, the states have been working with the UK government to carry out extensive preparations for all Brexit scenarios, including for a no-deal scenario, as I said earlier. Now, we face challenges of a much smaller magnitude than those faced by the UK, and we've been a third country to the UK from the beginning. We started preparing for the possibility of a UK referendum on EU membership in 2014, including the risks associated with a leave result from that referendum. And that meant that our government could lay out an immediate plan less than a week after the UK decided to leave the EU. And that has set us in good stead. It's set us on a path which has ensured that we have been closely engaged in the negotiation process from the outset, so that our interests have been taken into account. We've worked closely at a policy level across Whitehall, negotiated the strategy with the Cabinet Office at a senior level, and met and spoken frequently with Robin Walker, the Minister at the Department for Exiting the European Union, and meeting at least quarterly, but speaking more frequently. It is as a result of this work that the withdrawal agreement, negotiated, of course, by the UK and the Prime Minister, takes our interests into account. The implementation period and the Northern Ireland backstop would only apply to us insofar as Protocol 3 currently applies. So the agreement would not place any additional regulatory burdens on the islands that already exist. Similarly, the UK's own no-deal contingency planning takes our interests into account. We're working in lockstep with the UK and Jersey to ensure that our contingency planning will minimise any possible disruption that a no-deal exit might have on supply chains. The UK's nationwide contingency plan, people will recognise it as Operation Yellowhammer, makes express reference to us. The individual regional plan in Portsmouth includes priority of maintaining critical supplies to the island. So this means that we will get essential supplies of medicines and medical supplies, fuel and chemicals. There is no need to stockpile. That's not to say that there will be no disruption at all. Logistics and supply chains will need to change to cope with new checks on both sides of the channel. So whilst we will not see supplies dry up, we might see some reduction in the choice of food, particularly for fresh fruit and vegetables that come from the EU via the UK. And that will continue until the supply chains settle down to whatever the new normal is. I want to digress for a moment to talk about some good news in the last few weeks, which helps us set out where we presently are. We've managed other external challenges over the last year or so, at the same time as the Brexit challenge, created also by Europe in the form of the EU's list of uncooperative tax jurisdictions. On the 12th of March, the EU made a decision that might have passed many people in Guernsey by, but which those here today in this room will recognise as having been important in terms of how our jurisdiction is treated in the EU and further afield. In an update to its EU tax listing process, ECOFIN, the European Council of Finance Ministers, reaffirmed Guernsey's position as a cooperative jurisdiction for tax matters. The 90-plus third countries that were reviewed, including Guernsey, were assessed against standards of transparency, fair taxation, and anti-base erosion and profit shifting, BEPS. And as I said earlier, the UK will become a third country subject to the code group process after it leaves the EU. We're already through that process. No concerns were raised in respect of Guernsey's standards of tax transparency or anti-BEPS compliance. But in November 2017, we made a commitment to the EU to address concerns that the EU Code of Conduct Group had about a lack of legal substance requirements. Their concerns were based on new thinking at EU level and developing policy within the OECD's work. And given that this was new ground, we had to design, consult and legislate for a new regime in our tax system that met those concerns within just 12 months. We met this deadline and have delivered an effective and proportionate regime that works to address the EU's concerns and that works for Guernsey. Although, perhaps rather predictably and sadly, Oxfam, rather than concentrating on sorting out their own dire reputation and governance, and instead of focusing on their core purpose, found time this week to use their donors' generosity to come out and criticise the regime's effectiveness, self-evidently to this stage, 3 months into the new regime, without any evidence. Guernsey's new economic substance regime came into effect from the 1st of January 2019. All companies that are tax resident in Guernsey must comply with the economic substance regime for accounting periods commencing on or after that day and for all subsequent periods. Failure to comply will result in the application of a new sanctions regime, and those sanctions consist of escalating financial penalties, the spontaneous exchange of information, and ultimately company strike-off. We've recognised the importance of monitoring the effectiveness of the economic substance regime, and in particular the enforcement efforts, and that's of course something which is very familiar to the regulator's job in terms of demonstrating the effectiveness of enforcement. If there are any shortcomings identified, they will be remedied. This will ensure that the sanctions regime remains rigorous, effective and dissuasive. The EU has reviewed the changes made in Guernsey in regard to economic substance and has, rightly, given us a positive assessment, moving us from an annex to the list of uncooperative jurisdictions. Not all jurisdictions have been successful in the EU Code of Conduct Group process, and some finance centres have been given more time and remain on that annex, giving them continued uncertainty. We can be rightly proud of our achievement. We have worked closely with Jersey and the Isle of Man, had ongoing dialogue and negotiations with the Commission, and engaged with industry. The result will help to confirm our position that we are a regulated, well-regulated finance centre with high standards and a cooperative approach with other jurisdictions. And I'm pleased that the decision has rightly unlocked access once again to the European Investment Fund as a potential source of investment to Guernsey-based funds. We hope it will also highlight the inconsistency in other lists around the world, often generated for political reasons and that are not based on objective criteria or backed up with any evidence. The Commission has already expressed its concern that individual national lists, blacklists, are being maintained by EU member states. We know that some EU member states are now reviewing their own national lists, and we will continue to engage with them on this. And in particular, of course, we are actively pressing the Netherlands to take note of the EU process and outcome. We stand ready to help other jurisdictions as well, including, I hasten to add, any relevant EU member states that need help in developing and implementing their own substance requirements. We've risen to the challenge and demonstrated that we are undeniably a jurisdiction of substance. We have once again shown that we are a mature democracy with a good neighbour approach to cooperation. Guernsey's approved status for tax cooperation should enable us to develop strong relationships with the EU when we seek greater access to markets and will set us off on the right foot whenever the next phase of Brexit negotiation finally arrives. I can't talk about where we currently are without returning to the recent moves by Margaret Hodge and Andrew Mitchell to force a domestic UK policy on us without consent. Amendments to the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act last year were proposed, and the one, of course, on the overseas territories producing public registers was, of course, passed by the Houses of Parliament. The amendment proposed to the Financial Services Implementation of Legislation Bill, as I said, a Brexit implementation piece of legislation last month, end of February, beginning of March, covers the overseas territories, Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man. We expect that bill to be back before the House of Commons in the next few months if there is no deal. If that situation does not arise, we expect that the amendment will return in some other form. The amendment raises two issues. One on our constitutional position, and that was addressed to some extent by Jacob in his interview with William, and the other on the differing approaches between the UK and Guernsey on beneficial ownership transparency. On the constitutional issue, we must and will remain resolute and robust. This is where we can be certain of our rights. The Channel Islands and the Isle of Man are not, and never have been, part of or dependencies of the UK. Guernsey is not represented in Westminster. We have no voice and no vote within the Houses of Parliament, and we do not seek to change that. We are separate jurisdictions with our own legislatures, executives and judiciaries, with full domestic autonomy. The Channel Islands are British through their relationship with the Crown as the modern-day successor to the Duke of Normandy, who invaded England almost 1,000 years ago. We have a mature legal system with our own jurisprudence that is derived from Norman law. It is a centuries-held constitutional rule that the UK Parliament does not legislate for Guernsey on domestic matters without our consent. It is bizarre that the SNP have been supportive of this amendment so far, while simultaneously arguing that Westminster cannot legislate for Scotland, referencing the 20-year-old Sewell Convention. For that reason, I hope that in further dialogue, they can be persuaded that supporting this amendment is very much not in Scotland's interests. The UK Parliament cannot legislate for us to impose its policy on us in this way. Let's be unambiguous. Any legislation that is made will be inoperative and unenforceable. Such a move attempts to undermine our democracy and autonomy. It smacks of colonialism. Is it an irony or hypocrisy that the Labour Party supports such an amendment? On the policy point, we recognise that the UK has decided to adopt a public register of beneficial ownership of companies, and that there is a desire for overseas territories, the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, and indeed international partners to follow suit. Guernsey, as we know, has a view that an accurate and verified register of beneficial ownership, which is shared effectively and in a timely manner with tax jurisdictions, tax authorities and law enforcement bodies, is by a country mile the better approach. It is appropriate and consistent with the principles underpinning GDPR to consider a balance between placing personal information in the public domain, which is what a public register would do, and the public benefit of doing so. Arguments that a public register of beneficial ownership is the best way to fight economic crime and bolster national security are clouded with misinformation and prejudice. Guernsey maintains an accurate, verified and up-to-date register of beneficial ownership of greater quality than that in the UK. We share this information with law enforcement and other jurisdictions, including the UK, and where national security is involved, we can share that information within an hour. This is a standard that the National Crime Agency and the Home Office require, and the effectiveness of the information sharing has been affirmed by the Home Office and is kept under annual review. We've highlighted before that the development of an international standard in this area is a prerequisite to the adoption by Guernsey of a public register. But we are committed to the development and implementation of such an international standard. We want to work with the UK government and the relevant international bodies to achieve that objective of developing standards to increase the effectiveness of registers of beneficial ownership around the world. We do not agree, and there is no evidence that public registers, particularly of the type currently operated by the UK, are in any way proven to be more effective in tackling money laundering and financial crime than our own accurate and verified register that we have. Indeed, if Guernsey was to move to a UK-type system, it would represent a significant reduction of the quality of data available. We are simply not prepared to lower our standards to those of the UK. Just last month, the OECD published its beneficial ownership toolkit. Its focus is on the quality of data and how well the information is shared. The commentary on public registers is short. It just notes that the jury is still out, and public availability is not the same as transparency. One thing is clear, we strongly agree on the policy objective behind the amendment proposed by Hodge and Mitchell. Of course, we all wish to fight financial crime at the national and international level. That's why you're all here today as much as anything else. It is the fact that we have the same policy objective which makes the constitutional impact of the proposed amendment so disagreeable. So now, let's finally turn to the exam question I was set. Where is the bailiwick of Guernsey heading? Well, of course, the UK is constitutionally responsible for the island's formal international representation. This means that the UK has a duty to represent our interests in the UK's exit negotiations with the EU, and indeed in any subsequent negotiation for the new partnership with the EU. The UK has so far made clear that it will negotiate a new partnership for Guernsey, along with Jersey and the Isle of Man, that is commensurate with our economic needs. And we will need to make sure that they adhere to this commitment, because we do not want to get dragged into all sorts of obligations which are disproportionate to our size and needs. And all of this will be in the next phase of the negotiations, and we've been working to prepare ourselves for them. Guernsey is an important, as we know, an important economic partner to the UK. Just last year, the UK's Office of National Statistics, and I didn't know this until I saw it, reported that it was the fastest growing market for UK imports of goods and services between 2010 and 2017. The UK's exit will end the relationship that we have with the EU's customs union. But in order to safeguard the customs relationship with the UK and our economic relationship, the government of Guernsey signed a new customs framework with the UK government last November. And this will take effect when the UK leaves the EU in the event of a no deal, or when the UK leaves the EU's customs union itself at the end of the implementation period or as agreed. The customs framework ensures that Guernsey can continue to enjoy tariff-free trade with the UK whilst maintaining regulatory autonomy and fiscal independence, clearly critical. This will provide continuity for Guernsey and certainty for businesses and, of course, consumers. It also protects our centuries-old constitutional relationship, which allows for the free movement of goods with the UK, which, as set out and described in our historic royal charters. If we can get our trading relationship in goods on a firm footing, then we can also develop our trading relationship for services on top of those foundations. And the terms of future trade with the UK, with the EU, the terms of trade with the EU are dependent on, of course, the outcome of those negotiations with the UK. And so, of course, certainty is still lacking. And we are taking proactive steps to provide certainty where we can. So we are still in dialogue with the UK government about extending the UK's membership of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, to Guernsey, after the UK has established itself as a fully independent member. And this will help provide a business with a clear framework on which to undertake the trade in goods and services with the rest of the world. These negotiations are proceeding well, but they are complex, and it is important that we get it right, as they do set the tone for how we will manage trade issues with the UK for the years and indeed decades to come. It might not be possible to extend the UK's membership of the WTO before the UK leaves the EU, especially if that is next Friday, which of course remains the default legal position. But this should not cause us any immediate practical problems. For political reasons, it is desirable for Guernsey to be included in the UK's membership of the WTO to ensure that our position as a centre for global trade and to assist with aspirations to access new developing markets, particularly, of course, in the service sector so important to us. The extension of the WTO membership to Guernsey will become more desirable over time, I would suggest, particularly if the UK looks to negotiate ambitious new free trade agreements with developing markets using WTO rules as a base. Guernsey's relationship with the UK also allows, of course, as we know, for the free movement of people between our jurisdictions. And we are, of course, part of the common travel area with the UK and Ireland, as well as Jersey and the Isle of Man. And the UK, EU, Channel Islands and the Isle of Man have all committed to protect the common travel area. And so we will continue to enjoy free movement within the UK and Ireland, whatever the UK decides about Brexit. Now, we are working closely with the Home Office on a future immigration regime that respects the common travel area, but also takes account of our own interests and needs. Being frank, the UK's policy development is on hold during this current period of uncertainty. But what we can be sure of is that we will use the flexibility within the Common Travel Area to ensure that we have an immigration regime and system that works for us. And we'll also look afresh at our own population management regime to ensure that it complements the immigration system. We've already made a political commitment to respect the rights of EU nationals resident in Guernsey on exit day, again, whenever that is. And we have launched a settlement scheme for EU nationals resident in Guernsey, just like that launched in the UK. And I know Case has taken advantage of it for himself and his wife only in the last few days. Our scheme opened to applications on Monday this week. There is no fee to apply for that settled status. And I've said this before, and I will say it again. These citizens are welcome and they are a valued part of our community. And my key message really is this. In a world of instability and with so much uncertainty and no clarity as to the UK's path, should we be worried? Well, you can worry if you want to, but I'm not going to. Whilst we are uncertain about the outcome of the UK Brexit debate, we can be certain about the stability that Guernsey inherently has and that Guernsey's government has created during the Brexit process over the last year or so. And we do stand ready to respond to whichever path the UK chooses to take as it leaves the EU. I'm actually more confident about Guernsey's future than I was before the UK's referendum. Are there sunny uplands ahead of us? Yes, of that I am sure. Not because of the UK being or remaining a member of the EU, and not because of Brexit and the prospect of the UK throwing off, as it sees it, the shackles of the EU, forging new free trade agreements, but in spite of all that. Because despite all the white noise and acres of newsprint, fundamentally, nothing has really changed for Guernsey. And I think that very much echoes some of the comments that William was making in his address first thing this morning. All our core strengths remain. Our political stability and maturity, our autonomy and rule of law, our language and time zone, our high-quality regulation and regulators, our flexibility and agility, our common sense and pragmatism, our enterprise and ingenuity. And again, William referred to just some recent developments, the PIF, the Guernsey Green Fund and the Insurance Fund hybrid as examples of our ingenuity, which continues apace. All these strengths have seen us through centuries of external events, from the very first time Westminster flexed its muscles during the Civil War, through the Napoleonic Wars, through the ending of privateering, the abolition of the sugar tax, the occupation, the imposition and removal of exchange controls, and dare I say it, through the UK joining the common market in 1973, which of course was very much a threat at the time. And these strengths will see us through the UK leaving the EU with or without a deal, or indeed staying in with or without a second referendum. So where is Guernsey heading? I can't predict the future any better than anyone else in the room. But in any event, I suggest it will be more productive if instead of trying to do that, we all instead remember the words of Abraham Lincoln. If you want to predict the future, then create it. That is our challenge, and I am very confident that Guernsey will rise to it. Thank you very much.